A man saves money for 10 years. Carefully. Consistently. Disciplined. He skips vacations. Avoids unnecessary spending. Chooses safety over risk. By the end of it, he has a respectable amount in his bank account. It feels secure. Stable. Responsible. And yet, he's still not rich. At the same time, someone else does something that looks almost reckless. They don't obsess over saving. They don't track every small expense. In fact, sometimes it looks like they're spending more, not less. But 10 years later, the outcome is completely different. One has savings. The other has wealth. And that difference is where most people get it wrong. Because the idea that saving money makes you rich sounds logical, safe, sensible, proven. But it's also incomplete. And in some cases, misleading. Saving money protects you. It creates a buffer. A safety net. It helps you survive uncertainty. But it doesn't scale. That's the part people don't like hearing. Because saving feels like progress. You see the number in your account grow. Slowly. Predictably. It gives you control. But control and growth are not the same thing. And confusing the two is where the gap begins. Let's slow this down. When you save money, you're essentially doing one thing. You're delaying consumption. You're choosing not to spend today, so you can have more tomorrow. That's useful. Necessary, even. But it has a limit. Because money sitting still doesn't multiply in any meaningful way. In fact, over time, it quietly loses value. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just steadily. Inflation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like a loss. But every year, the same amount of money buys you slightly less. Which means your safe savings are slowly shrinking in real terms. Now here's where things start to shift. Rich people don't ignore saving. They just don't rely on it. Because they understand something simple. Wealth isn't built by holding money. It's built by deploying it. That word matters. Deploying. Not saving. Not storing. Using. And this is where the system looks completely different depending on how you see money. For most people, money is something to protect. For wealthy individuals, money is something to use. Strategically. Continuously. Think about it this way. If you earn 1 Indian rupee lakh and save Indian rupee 20,000, you've protected 20,000 Indian rupees. But the remaining 80,000 Indian rupees? It's gone. Spent. Consumed. Finished. Now imagine a different approach. Instead of focusing on how much you save, you focus on where your money goes. Not in a restrictive way. In a structural way. Because every rupee has a direction. It either moves toward consumption, or toward creation. Consumption ends the cycle. Creation continues it. This is the part that rarely gets explained clearly. Rich people don't just spend or save. They allocate. A portion of their money is intentionally directed into assets. Things that produce value. Generate income. Or grow over time. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But consistently. And once that process starts, something interesting happens. Their money begins to work independently of their time. That's the shift. From effort to system. Because saving money still depends on you. Your discipline. Your decisions. Your restraint. But assets don't. Once they're in motion, they continue. A business generates revenue. An investment grows. A system compounds. And suddenly, the relationship with money changes. You're no longer just earning and protecting. You're building. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable again. Because this doesn't mean rich people never spend. They do. Often more than the average person. But the source of that spending is different. Most people spend from income. Rich people spend from outcomes. There's a gap between those two things. And inside that gap is where wealth is created. Income is limited. It depends on time, effort, and opportunity. Outcomes, on the other hand, can scale. A single decision can generate returns for years. That's not theory. It's structure. But here's the catch. This system is invisible at the beginning. When someone starts allocating money into assets, nothing looks different. Their lifestyle doesn't suddenly improve. Their bank balance might even look smaller, which makes it feel like they're falling behind. While others are upgrading their lives, they're quietly building something else. And that's why most people don't stick with it. Because early progress is hidden. Delayed. Almost boring. Saving gives you immediate feedback. You see the number go up. Investing, building, allocating, often doesn't. At least not in the beginning. So people default to what feels productive, even if it isn't transformative. Now let's talk about risk. Because this is where things get misunderstood. It's easy to assume that wealthy people just take bigger risks. That they're more aggressive. More comfortable with uncertainty. Sometimes that's true. but more often, they're just operating with a different definition of risk. For most people, risk means losing money. For the wealthy, risk often means not growing it. That shift changes everything. Because once you see stagnation as a form of risk, saving alone doesn't feel safe anymore. It feels incomplete. Now zoom out. Think about the system most people are part of. You earn. You spend. You save what's left. And then you repeat. It's predictable, structured, comfortable. But it has a ceiling. Because your savings are always a fraction of your income. And your income is limited. So even with discipline, progress is slow. Now compare that to a system where you earn, you allocate first, you invest consistently, and you let outcomes compound. The structure is different. And over time, the results are dramatically different. This is why two people with the same income can end up in completely different financial positions. Not because one worked harder, but because one built systems, while the other relied on habits. Habits matter. But systems scale. And wealth is a scaling problem. Now, there's another layer to this. One that's less obvious. Saving money feels responsible. It's socially reinforced, encouraged, expected. But building wealth often looks strange. It can involve delayed gratification, uncertainty, decisions that don't make sense to others, which creates friction. Because now you're not just managing money, you're managing perception. And that's harder than it sounds. It's easier to follow the familiar path. Earn, save, stay safe. Even if that path leads to limitation. Because at least it's predictable. But predictability doesn't create leverage. And leverage is what separates income from wealth. Leverage of capital. Leverage of time. Leverage of systems. Saving doesn't create leverage. It preserves. Allocation does. And this is where the entire idea flips. The goal isn't to save as much as possible. The goal is to direct as much as possible into things that grow. Because once growth begins, it compounds. And compounding changes the timeline. What takes decades through saving can accelerate through allocation. Not instantly. Not easily. But structurally. Now here's the part most people don't expect. This approach doesn't feel secure in the beginning. It feels uncertain. Because instead of holding money, you're putting it to work. And work implies variability, movement, change, which feels uncomfortable. But over time, that discomfort shifts. Because the system starts producing results. Slowly at first. Then more noticeably. Until one day, the outputs become larger than the inputs. And that's when things change. Because now, your money isn't just supporting your life. It's expanding it. And at that point, saving becomes a byproduct. Not the strategy. So the idea that rich people don't save money isn't entirely accurate. They just don't treat saving as the end goal. They treat it as a temporary state. A transition. Money comes in. It pauses briefly. Then it moves. Always with a purpose. Always toward growth. And that movement is what creates distance between income and wealth. So the real question isn't whether you should save. It's what happens to your money after you do. Does it stay still? Or does it move? Because over time, that answer becomes the difference between having money and building something that doesn't depend on you at all. And if that system never gets built, then no matter how much you earn, or how carefully you save, you might just be protecting something that was never designed to grow in the first place. So the next time you move money into your savings, pause for a moment. Not to question the habit, but to question the destination. Because if money is meant to move, what happens when it doesn't? And more importantly, what could it become if it did?